Yes, thank you very much for staying this long and persevering. I really appreciate it. Let me just, first of all, thank you, Marlene, for inviting me to be part of this wonderful workshop. I've been really enjoying all the presentations here. But let me link what Marlene said in the morning, and hopefully I quote you correctly, that 1/4 of a century of violent changes demands the society that went through these changes for the past 25 years. They want conservative means, and they want to be back to normality. And I think this is really interesting in how some policing strategies are now crystallizing. So I'm trying to echo what Larry said, crystallizing in former Soviet states, in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, and Ukraine. Today, for the purposes of time, but also comparative perspective, I'm going to talk more about Kazakhstan and Ukraine as a comparative example. What we all know about, and I'll be talking about policing specifically, so we all know about policing, that this is one of the least reformed post-Soviet institutions in former Soviet states, and that is because, despite a lot of international efforts, some of the post-Soviet legacies of politicized, militarized, punitive policing continue. But I want to draw your attention to some of the changes that were made to everyday policing in urban areas that were driven by local demand, domestic changes by local society, by the societies, but nevertheless inspired by some international practices, and specifically broken windows policing. So all of you know that broken windows policing was first generated as a theory in 1980s, and the main premise is that by policing small asocial behaviors like littering, loitering, panhandling, prostitution, public urination, we can prevent large crimes from taking place. And this theory was first applied in practice in New York City, widely praised in the 1990s for being efficient. And then it was copied by other US cities, other cities in the world, and now it's Kazakhstan's and Ukraine's turn. In Kazakhstan, the strategy for 2050 development, or Kazakhstan 2050 development strategy, specifically refers to the original broken theory policing strategy as a prototype for its current zero tolerance policing. So there is a direct reference to New York experience as this wonderful prototype for establishing good policing practices in today's Kazakhstan. And of course, this theory overall, the original and the later reiterations, what it does, it links social norms with legal enforcement. So it provides legal tools for enforcing specific understanding of what is appropriate socially in public spaces. In Kazakhstan, what's considered to be appropriate, and I am citing here Interior Ministry, hooliganism, soliciting in public areas, so this is my best translation of приставание в общественных местах, damages to public property, littering, loitering. And there is, of course, an increased reporting of those crimes being prevented or captured, and perpetrators of those crimes being fined, and then also, reported. So in Ukraine, the reference is more indirect. There is no really official police reform document, but in my interviews with Interior Ministry officials, they do refer to broken windows policing as an inspiration for the current urban policing changes in Ukraine, and we know that it's financed widely by the United States, the European Union, and other donors. So one of the things that they enforce in everyday life is illegal parking, homelessness, smoking in undesignated areas, and so on. So the question that I am trying to answer during this presentation is what could go wrong in copying and mimicking controversial policing strategies from democratic countries in an authoritarian context or semi-authoritarian context. Of course, the most obvious downside of this is this strategy is transferred to post-Soviet reality, and before that, zero tolerance policing was also implemented in Georgia. Some elements of it are now enforced in urban areas in Kyrgyzstan and Bishkek. Foul language, for instance, now is enforceable through policing. You can be fined for that. The most obvious downside is that in a semi-authoritarian or authoritarian context, you don't really hear the criticism that accompanied this strategy in Western societies. But the criticism is fairly substantial. So some of it goes, some broader criticism says that this policing, it specifically disenfranchises more cultured citizens from ill-fitting citizens or urban spaces. And there is the causal link between everyday policing and this bigger idea of safer societies is really not proven. So, but the reason, so the critics go on in Western society, say that the reason why broken policing came to be in New York and other Western cities, by the way, New York now is backpedaling on this policing strategy, it's because of the rapid socioeconomic changes in the 70s and the 80s in urban areas in the United States, where you see cities becoming those drivers of economic development and attracting more people, and we see a rapid emergence of urban middle class. That, at the same time, we see a diversification of cultural expressions in public spaces in urban areas. So there is this demand by the urban middle class to draw a line, what is permitted and what's not permitted in public spaces in urban areas. And I think this criticism really resonates with some of the literature that we see emerging on Central Asia and on former Soviet states, that there is indeed, we do see that cities become those magnets for economic development. And in Kazakhstan and Ukraine specifically, when the overall population was decreasing in those countries, the urban population has been increasing. And Marlene also alluded to the fact that there is a high percentage of ethnic Kazakhs not from Kazakhstan living in Kazakhstan right now. And I think this zero-tolerance policing is also a demand by the urban middle class. I'm not going to go too much into theories of how policing comes out to be, how it's a kind of extension of the empowered political economic class. But what I'm trying to say here is that this zero-tolerance policing and increased reporting on small a social behaviors, it really reinforces some of the fault lines that we see in urban areas. So in Kazakhstan, and I'm looking at Astana and Almaty specifically, the way Interior Ministry formulates the rationale for zero-tolerance policing is that there is a need to create a moral and cultural baseline for behavior in urban areas, and that, quote-unquote, guests of capital Astana should learn how to behave in urban settings in order for us to be a legally bound and legally orderly society. So it does reinforce this vernacular category of being a newly arrived resident of urban areas versus long-term urban resident. And where this policy is specifically enforced is in areas where long-term urban residents and newly arrived urban residents tend to mingle, so in public squares or in shopping malls, or where those newly arrived urban residents or migrants, internal migrants, tend to concentrate, like train stations, specific universities, or areas where they are most likely to be employed. Quickly on Ukraine. In Ukraine, I think the fault line, and that comes from my field work with Ukrainian police forces in central Kiev, the divide is more between the citizens who are ready to embark on this notion of a reborn nation after Euromaidan, create a more European state, a civilized state, and those who feel disenfranchised by those recent changes and not necessarily as excited about becoming more European and might have some nostalgic feelings about the Soviet period or Russia. So when we see this, when we see police forces at work in urban areas, most of the confrontations happened between people who, young men who were probably unemployed and were very loud in areas close to downtown Kiev, or women who were smoking, sitting on stairs of a building as opposed to on a bench, so the police would ask them to go and sit on the bench. And there was this tension of, between those citizens who confronted this new force and saying, you know, what are you here for? What do you represent? This is not what we're used to seeing. And the way Interior Ministry brands its new police force is that it really takes really strong measures against former militia officers who represent the old state. So there is a lot of PR going on around how they take down those former militia officers in their day-to-day work. But again, going back to what actually Marlene said in her presentation, this everyday enforcement, the new strategy of policing, it also is a part of a bigger imagined nation. In Kazakhstan, the 2050 policy is all about creating a post-industrial nation, post-industrial state, by developing entrepreneurialism, fostering economic development, but creating this legal and moral base for behavior is part of this bigger strategy. And in Europe, and in Ukraine, it is becoming more of a European state. And to quote former Deputy Interior Minister, that police police reform is the first attempt to create a government agency of a European sample. So in this environment, anyone who is challenging those strategies are considered to be anti-reformist and sometimes even unpatriotic, maybe pro-Russian in Ukraine. But what I think some of the takeaways for us from this dynamics is that some bad governance strategies don't necessarily originate from Russia or China. They can also originate from the United States, given also that in an authoritarian context, there isn't really debate that does take place in the United States, but those strategies are mimicked in post-Soviet context without the accompanying debate. What is not, so there isn't really much reporting of the new zero-tolerance policing, broken windows policing in Kazakhstan in urban areas. And everyone loves police reform in Ukraine because I think it looks so familiar to a Western eye. It is not something Soviet. It is not something post-Soviet. Therefore, it must be okay. So I think this is some kind of oversight on the part of international community when we see this zero-tolerance policies implemented or wrapped in different packages. It doesn't really raise red flags when it should be, I think. But it also, what we see in an authoritarian context, it exacerbates some of the downsides and negative aspects of the original policy, and makes it even worse on the ground. So disenfranchises more groups on the ground. Just a quick note on how to go about it, since I guess this is a policy workshop. I think, first of all, I think we should be always very cautious whenever we hear zero tolerance anything. It will likely be an authoritarian outcome. It will likely be not rule of law program, but rule by law program. Second, I think it is important before any strategy is, before any security sector assistance is allocated, I think it's more important to create oversight mechanisms and encourage venues for public discussion before anything is brought from other contexts to a local context. And then finally, beyond just, for instance, in reforming police forces or reforming other security institutions, beyond just looking at crime rates or whatever the loopholes in security in any given context, it is important to understand the broader context of how wealth is allocated, what are the cultural divides in the society, what has been the, what are the local changes that can allow for new strategies to take root or reject them. And I think this principles, they apply beyond policing. They apply to border guards, they apply to security sector, the military security councils and intelligence collection overall in Central Asia and other former Soviet states.